All right, well, it looks like just about everyone has arrived, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll kick us off and like to welcome everyone and say good evening. My name is Heather Miller. I am an adult programming librarian at the La Crosse Public Library, and I'm so glad you could join us this evening for our special presentation with Faith Anaker of Physiology Food. So I hope you are all like me and are very excited to learn about how to ferment food and how to let our food be our health. So I'm very excited, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Faith. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Heather. I'm pretty glad for the opportunity. This is my first time on Zoom, so everybody has to forgive me for my awkwardness with the technology. I'm not close to the thing, and I don't really like technology very much. So, but I do like fermenting. So, yeah, I'll give you a little bit of my background, and then I'll share a little bit of history of fermented foods and some of the health benefits, and then show you guys how you can make it at home. And then at the end, we can have a little time for questions, like Heather said. And then if the questions get complicated, you guys can email me anytime too. And I welcome questions through email too. So yeah, when I got pregnant with my first daughter, I read this book called A Good Life by Helen and Scott Nearing. Geez, that was nearly 30 years ago. And it was a life changer for me. I really wanted to live this good life of back to the land and homesteading and just like figure out how to do everything for myself. So my husband and I, we built our house from the trees in the woods, and we really tried to grow all our own food while we were raising our 4 kids, which was really a crazy undertaking. And I learned a whole lot about just being connected with the land and the relationships involved with food and health, and just studied a whole lot during those years. And I was doing carpentry with my husband when this business, Physiology, the person wanted to get out of it. It was a young company, and he realized how much work it was. And at that point in my life, I had been volunteering all my time for our local herbal group, all my spare time, and I was trying to make this herbal group into this thing that it wasn't. And physiology was just a perfect fit for me to integrate my passion for holistic health and wise traditional lifestyle. And I did want to get out and teach and share this information with people. So it was just a really perfect fit, especially because we use wild foods in some of the ferments, and wild food is really a big passion of mine too. So that was 8 years ago now. So I've been doing this for 8 years, and boy, I've learned a whole lot. Especially in classes, when I've gotten out with groups of people teaching, I learn a whole lot from the people who come to the classes, which has been really, really fun. So I've heard all kinds of really amazing stories of like life-changing stories of people who turn their life around by just changing their diet. And like really severe chronic health conditions, people with cancer and MS, and it's just unbelievable how many stories I've heard from physiology, from doing this physiology and going out and meeting people. So it's been pretty fun. So here we make a line of fermented vegetables, but my other passions are also all kinds of ferments too. So I'd like to share a little bit more about that too, maybe in the future with the library. But yeah, so as far as the history of fermented foods, it's really pretty simple. Every culture all around the world throughout history has always used salt to preserve their food. Just any culture you pick, they take whatever vegetables they had, and somehow thousands of years ago, they figured out if they put salt in it, it would preserve it. Now, way back then, people didn't know about probiotics. They didn't know about your microbiome. They didn't know about gut health, but they did actually have a healthy lifestyle. Honestly, a really good resource to look into if you're interested in health is Westin Price Foundation. Westin Price was a dentist who studied indigenous cultures' teeth to find their health and the correlations of their diet and their health. There's some archaeology involved in all that stuff too. But Westin Price Foundation is an amazing resource of information about nutritious foods, and that's kind of where I adapted this concept of the wise traditional lifestyle. It's, encompassing the things that people in the Westin Price Foundation have observed as well. So yeah, so that's just a generic thing about the history of fermented foods. More specifically, Asian cultures, you don't have any meal without a array of different, what they call pickles. Like in Asia, they call fermented foods pickles, and here we call things that were cooked in vinegar pickles. It's kind of funny because technically fermented foods are the real pickles. So yeah, every Asian culture, they'll ferment single vegetables, and they dry pack them. You just take a vegetable and pack it with salt, and it's dry. Some cultures will take greens and dry them with salt, and they're just a dry salted green that you can use. I guess the most famous ferment is kimchi, right? So in Korea, on a national average, Korean people eat a quarter cup of kimchi every single day. They actually take a day off work in the year to make their kimchi for a year. It's like a holiday in Korea. Yeah, everybody just loves kimchi in Korea, I guess. And every family has their own recipe, and it can change. So that's kind of a fun thing to think about with ferments is there's no rules, really. I mean, the only rule is the salt. So yeah, so, oh, I should say I shared with you guys a handout. There's 4 pages to that. I don't like reading off a handout, so I might reference some of this information, but it's for you to have at home and have this information. And maybe, I don't know if you want to take any notes or whatever too, but yeah, so the health benefits, right? What are we talking about here? If people have heard on the news or from doctors, or it's kind of all over the place these days about how important our microbiome is. We are in relationship with our environment constantly, so we're covered with, like, our bodies are more bacteria than human cells. Our bodies are covered with bacteria all the time. And I'm a little bit scared for people who are worried about getting sick and using antibacterial hand sanitizers, especially with COVID now. It's really a concern that these hand sanitizers and these antibacterial soaps are killing your good bacteria. So you're being depleted all the time of these good bacteria that you need, right? We're just in relationship all the time. We need to keep it balanced. So that's what the fermented foods are helping with, is balancing this bacteria. And so what does that do? It's helping, like, basically your gut is, like, that's the house of your immune system. I call it like your second, it's actually your first mind. Like in Eastern traditions, they think like you have 3 minds. You have your head mind, your heart mind, and your gut mind. And this is like really, these minds are actually where our real wisdom comes from. And like Eastern cultures, they kind of talk about how the head mind is actually, like, we need to control that, because that can kind of get confused and out of whack. But if you listen to your gut, or if you listen to your heart, you're actually on a good track. So I'm sure everybody's heard of, trust your gut. So like, if your gut's not right, you're not right. So right, when you have that good balance, your immune system is able to work properly. You're able to digest your foods. You're able to absorb the nutrients from your foods. And now with this modern diet, with processed foods, it's just chronic health conditions are constantly on the rise. And it really is because we're veering away from the way we were meant to eat. If you think of us, like, we're biological entities, and it's really necessary to look at optimizing your health. What can I do to optimize my health? Like, avoid things that are bad, do things that are good for you, which is simply whole foods and things like that. So another really important thing that people haven't been thinking about as much as they should is enzymes. Enzymes are like a key factor in the function of your body on a cellular level. If you don't have enzymes, you're just not making energy, or you're cellularly, you're not functioning correctly. Raw fermented foods are packed with enzymes, they're packed with fiber. When you ferment vegetables, you're also increasing some of the B vitamins through the fermentation process, and you're preserving the C vitamins. So you actually have more nutrient density when you ferment your vegetables in a lot of cases. I'm not sure about every case. Yeah, that's just kind of a pretty broad overview. I think it is really worth doing more research. I'm not very good at the scientific kind of talk, but just in general, it's necessary to have, I say, a couple tablespoons a couple times a day of a fermented vegetable. And I think that yogurt is really important too. I like to have a little bit of yogurt in my diet every day. So we're looking for biodiversity, so lots of species. And I'll get more into the details of the bacteria in the fermented vegetables when we talk about how to make it. So yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of the health benefits. The second page of my hand, I just wanted to tell you guys, the first class I ever taught, I taught with a very dear friend who had one of the first fermented food companies around that went out of business, and she wrote most of the second page, and it's just a beautiful thing to read, to think about when you start cooking. Like, it's kind of like a mindfulness practice thing. Just consider that when you go to make your first ferment. Just read through that and consider that. I think it's really sweet. Yeah, so I'm not going to read it to you. But yeah, so the last page of the handout, this is kind of, I'm going to go over the sciencey piece before we talk about actually making ferments. The floral succession of fermentation of cabbage, that's the fourth page on the handout I sent you guys. This kind of helps people not worry about their ferments, because there's really clear stages. So this handout is telling you the ideal temperature to ferment vegetables is 64.4 degrees. Now, you think of these bacteria, they're living organisms, right? So if they get a little warmer, a little cooler, that's okay, but this is the temperature they like. So just think about, if it's cooler, they're going to be slow and sluggish. If it's warmer, they're going to go faster, right? But 64 degrees is really ideal. And then it explains how the first 3 days when you start fermenting, there's this first kind of bacteria that comes in, and it's a really aggressive bacteria. And this is the bacteria that pushes out, it basically fights off anything that it doesn't want in there. And this is part of the safety piece, is in those first 3 days, usually the pH drops right away. So this strong bacteria, it makes carbon dioxide and it gases, and it does this thing that's like setting the stage for the good fermentation to happen, makes it safe. And then you have 3 weeks of like fermenting, right? And then in the end, even more bacteria come in and kind of finish it off. So this is just a nice thing for you to look at, to just know what the scientific process is, I guess, is what I think about that. So yeah, so I guess the main reason we're here is to learn how to actually do fermenting, right? So there's two major ways you ferment vegetables at home, and that's with brine or like a sauerkraut, right? So brine is when you add salt water, and you can, so this here is, can you see that? these are pieces of turnips, and they're in a liquid brine. They're just in this pint jar. They're turnips with a little turmeric. And it's a really easy way, like if you have a bunch of roots and you don't have a lot of time, you can cut them up and just put this brine in there, and the brine is protecting them, right? So that's a really good way to do. Or like hot peppers. This is some hot peppers. That is kind of far away, isn't it? It's a little far away. I'll just bring it up a little closer. This is beautiful. So these are wild ramps in brine. You can see, can you tell there's juice in there? Yeah, you can see that.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really easy thing to do. You just make the brine. And yeah, that's really easy. This is a blended tomatillo, like a salsa verde. But we'll get into how to do that. Okay. So that's an overview of brine vegetables, but okay, so then we have this sheet on how to make it. This hopefully has everything on it that you need. And I mentioned, obviously, you can go online and find a million recipes, which is really fun. So you consider what spices. Is this working? I don't see anybody at all.
Yep, it's working. Everything's
Okay. Well, if it didn't work, you wouldn't be able to tell me, but okay. So what do you want to ferment? You can use any spices, any vegetables, just absolutely anything out of your garden. So recipes are kind of a big deal. I guess I'll talk about my Latin style ferment, the Curdito. That's a traditional El Salvadorian ferment. That has lime, cilantro, oregano, red chili peppers, carrots, and red peppers in it. In kraut kind of things, I suggest people use about 70% cabbage, like around 70%. You could do 50% roots and 50% cabbage, but I kind of stick to about 70% cabbage and 50% or 30% other things. So yeah, so when you get started, you want to just have, be mindful of your space. You want your space clean. I like to use hydrogen peroxide that's about 3% to sanitize surfaces. You can bake things in the oven, like glass, you can bake in the oven to sanitize it if you're reusing a jar or something like that. Make sure it's really clean, but then you can put it in the oven at 250 for 10 minutes and that'll sanitize it. And you do want to have either a brand new jar or a sanitized jar, because you don't know if there's just a little bit of yeast from the air. Yeast is kind of our biggest issue with fermenting because it's everywhere. And it's okay to have a little bit of yeast, but it's not as good a quality ferment. So that's why you want to be really careful with being sanitary. It's not so much the bacteria, because like I said, that pH drops and that protects it. That's why fermented foods are considered non-potentially hazardous. There is no reported cases of anybody anywhere. In my 8 years of doing this and meeting Sandor Katz, who's traveled the world, he's like a best-selling author about fermentation. And he said that he's never found any story of anybody getting sick from eating fermented foods. So it's because if it's bad, it tastes really, really bad. Like if it gets contaminated, it's so obvious. So if people are worried, you can order a little pH test strips. They're just like a little tiny strip of paper that you can put in there, and it gives you the guide, and you're good as long as you're below 4.5. And I find my pH is always right around 3. It never really goes above 3. Okay, so enough about sanitizing. Clean the vegetables. This is an interesting thing to consider, that a tiny bit of dirt from your garden or from your, from your neighbor farmer's organic garden is fine. That might have some other kinds of little bacteria that are good too. Like the tiniest bit of dirt is totally fine. You want to take off things that are rotten or not vibrant. So clean the vegetables. There's many different ways that you can cut vegetables per crop. So one thing to consider, usually maybe you're doing sauerkraut. When you cut into a cabbage, you got a core, right? So you take the core out first, and that core has a lot more sugars and starches in it. And this actually really helps your ferment. So you do want to use the core. You can grate it with a cheese grater and make sure you use that, because those sugars and starches that are in the core is going to really be nice. A lot of people like to use like those mandolin slicers. I don't know if you guys have seen that. They're like longer and you can just, I'm kind of afraid of them because I think I'll cut my finger. So different people like different size pieces. Cut it. If you cut it really thin, if you cut your cabbage really thin, it's going to be easier to get it to get juicy. If you cut pieces that are like thicker, maybe you would add a little bit of saltwater brine to that, right? So yeah, so thinner pieces, you'll get that juice out easier. Thicker pieces, you can always add a little saltwater brine if you don't have enough juice. So you don't need any special equipment for fermenting. I know there's a lot of products on the market for airlocks and things like that. So this is how I ferment it all. Just tighten that jar lid down really tight. And I was telling you about that initial stage where that heavy bacteria comes in and pushes out everything. That release of carbon dioxide is powerful enough to push past there's like little gaskets in these type of lids. It's just a little plasticky thing. So juice will leak out, even if you tighten it down just as tight as you can possibly tighten it. So.
I have a question.
Huh?
I have a question. How long do you have to wait before you can eat it, and how long does it last on the shelf?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, so this fourth page is telling us that the perfect, like we know that it's finishing off after, well, they're saying 20 days, but because I was saying about the temperature variations too, I always wait a month. And I had a woman in a class one time from Asia tell me that in Asia, they actually had a public service announcement telling people to stop eating their ferments too early, that you really do want to wait for it to be finished. It's super common for people to just start eating them right away. Like in South America and in Asia and stuff, that you just have a jar on the counter and you keep adding more vegetables and you keep eating it, but you really want this full process to happen. So wait a month at 60, 65 degrees. It's okay to let it ferment for several months. I had a microbiologist tell me she was testing the count on the probiotics in the ferments, and she found that at room temperature, the probiotics started to die off at 7 months, okay? At room temperature, 7 months. So if it's in the fridge, I don't know exactly how long it lasts, but we say probably about 2 years. It's pretty likely it lasts about 2 years in the fridge. I've had people eat 3-year-old kraut before and say it was still good. So some people say it lasts 3 years. It does start to get a little soft, and that's back to the yeast issue, right? Because yeast is everywhere. There's going to be some yeast in the food, so that's why it starts to deteriorate. But it still has that low pH, so you don't have to worry. It's just a matter of the flavor. But yeah, I mean, definitely a year, it's still really, really good. 2 years, it's still pretty good. 3 years, it's getting kind of mushy. Yeah. So the salt. A lot of people think Himalayan salt is really great. I worry about why is it so cheap and why are we bringing it out of these, so far away. So I always use real salt. Redmond is in Utah. They minimally, they don't refine it. Right? It's just real salt. It's not refined. It's never heated. It's from America. It's got all the different minerals and things in it. So I always recommend to use that. They have it at in the bulk section at the co-op. They have bags of it at the co-op. It's really the best option. So you do 2% by weight. So if you're that's how I figure how much salt to use, because I'll make different size batches all the time. So I'll just use a calculator, say how many pounds, like in a gallon jar. So this is a gallon jar, right? This is 8 pounds about when it's full. So I'll just, use a calculator and say 8 times 0.02. And but then you got this decimal for pounds, whatever. It really can be pretty flexible. You can use anywhere from 1 to 4% salt, but 2% it's safer than 1%, right? I found a document one time that said it was like the USDA back in the 30s said legally to sell sauerkraut it must be 2% salt. So at home, if you don't like salt as much, you could use less salt, but I recommend more salt because the probiotic bacteria, they like the salt. So if you have a higher salt content, you're going to increase the probiotic growth too. But personally, flavor-wise, I think 2% is just what I like the best. That microbiologist I mentioned, she had a line of ferments that she makes, and she said she used 3% in all her ferments, and she's just educating people that it's a better quality health food. But I don't like to eat it if it's that much. So yeah, so for a gallon, it'd be about 3 to 4 tablespoons, between 3 or 4 tablespoons. A quart would be about a tablespoon, like a good tablespoon in a quart jar. So 2 pounds, if you had 2 pounds of cabbage and you chop it up, right? And then you put your salt in it. Yeah, that's about 2%. So, all right, so this is the Curdito that I made here today. We made a 360-pound batch, and I just took this out. This has a little cilantro, a little carrots. It's sliced thin, like I was showing you, thin stuff. And when you make it at home, you just kind of start squeezing it. You're kind of beating it up a little bit. And when you're doing that, you're looking for, when you squeeze it, you're going to get, it's going to drip juice. Can you see that juice dripping? There's juice. Yeah, okay. So that's what you want to see. You want to see that there's enough juice. The probiotic bacteria are living in the juice. They're not living in the cabbage or in the food. They're living in the juice. So the more juice, the better. That's why I kind of encourage people, like, don't hesitate to use a little brine, because these guys are living in there. And really, kraut juice shots, it's pretty convenient to get your probiotics. Like, just take a 1 ounce shot of the kraut juice, and then you can just replace it with a little salt water, let it sit on your counter more and grow it a little more. That's what I like to do. So this is probably going to be juicy enough. Yeah, it's a pretty decent recipe. A little lime. I like the lime and cilantro. And then you're going to stuff it into the jar, whatever jar, no fancy jar, just any size jar. Well, these are the two, really. One of these jars is probably what you should use. Well, if you had a crock, that would be nice. But that's like a whole different thing, because like open crock method, you're really susceptible to contamination with yeast and things. And like the old timers, you know, they'd go and scrape all the junk off the top of their crock. And, this way, if you have a sealed jar, you'll find that you don't lose as much on the top. Which, I guess that's a really important point, is if you get a little contamination on the top of your jar, you can scrape it off, get down to where the juice is. The oxygen is what's gonna damage it. I guess I was gonna get into fermentation problems later. Oh, I guessed a little bit wrong. Just a little bit more. So I kind of quickened the process there a little bit by doing it that way. So when you fill up a jar, you're gonna want about an inch of headspace on the top. And you're gonna want, I'm gonna come around. Can you see how that's juice on the top?
We sure can.
That's juice on the top of the jar. The more the better, you know, because anything that's going above the juice is gonna get funky, it'll get yeasty or moldy or whatever like that. So then, I always forget to mention this until, I should have mentioned it earlier. You want to save back a couple of the outer leaves from your cabbage, and that's going to be like your little weight and your little protector. And when you go to eat your kraut, you can toss this because it's just like your protector. So that's going to hold your good kraut down below the juice. I'm coming around. So now I have the jar. See, the level is right up to here. And there's juice in there. And it's protected by that cabbage. So this is just right. This will work. And then, like I said, make sure you wipe this edge of the jar. I forgot one thing. I'm just gonna grab a rag really quick. Of course, I had to forget one thing. I use peroxide at the kitchen. I'll dampen my rag with a little bit of peroxide and make sure that's really good and clean. And then, yeah, you want to tighten that pretty darn tight. And you can check it in a few days too and tighten it again. So this jar is ready to ferment. Oh. And you want to put it in a bowl or something like that, because those first 3 days, remember, I mentioned it could leak a little juice. So put it in a bowl by your sink the first 3 days. Keep an eye on it. When it gets past that initial stage, that's when you can tighten it up again and put it in your, like out of the sun and in the pantry or in the basement or somewhere where it stays about 65 degrees. If you let it warm up a little more, it'll ferment a little faster. And I find the flavor is not quite as good. If it ferments a little faster, it gets a little bit bitter. Yeah. So do we have any questions at this point? Are you there?
We are, yes. Feel free if you'd like to ask some questions to unmute yourself or use the chat feature and I can share those with Faith.
So I was going to also overview some potential fermentation problems that's on your list here too. Yeah, bad smell, don't eat it, right? If it's gross, like something went wrong. I would say in my 8 years, the only time I've ever seen that was the person who I bought the business from. He only used 1% salt. And I had a jar that he gave me that had been like 6 years old. There was a jar that I found in like a bunch of his old stuff. That's the only time I've ever seen something like gross. Yeah, I guess I kind of did already go over this. If the vegetables are soft, you probably didn't have enough salt in there. So the salt is so important. Yeah, the white looking. So the most common thing you'll see is there'll be like a white film on top, and that's the yeast. It's pretty common that you'll get like a white layer, and that will spread. So you could take it off if you're going to leave it to ferment longer. Like if you see it happening, you could quick take it off, because it will keep growing, and it could put that yeast flavor. I'm really sensitive to yeast, and I really don't like it, so I like to get that off if I have it. Like sometimes that happens at home for me more than here, because at home I'm a little less careful than I am here. Oh yeah, turning brown on the top. Oxidation, right? So when you don't want oxygen in there. It happens quite a bit, like in the refrigerator, when your kraut's sitting in the refrigerator for months, that's when you usually see that. And that's why, like, I put on my label when I sell it, I say, make sure the vegetables are always submerged in the juice. And if you run low on juice, just add more salt water. That's really probably the biggest thing you're gonna run into. Yeah. So no questions yet, huh? No questions.
I've got a question for you. I was just thinking if I had a jar of something that I made and it was done fermenting and I opened it up to eat some, how long would it be good in the fridge? Like opening it and closing it and storing it in the fridge.
Yeah, it really depends on how much oxygen you have in there. If you're keeping the juice level up, like I said, it could last for 3 years in a full jar. If it was a full jar and it was dark, it could last for 3 years. If you're having a couple tablespoons a couple times a day, it's not going to last that long.
Right.
But
you had said to add salt water or some type of brine to cover the top. Okay.
It's really the best, because then, like I said, you could take that kraut juice shot too if you don't feel like eating the kraut one day,
Mm-hmm.
And then you can put it back on your counter for a few days too. I guess I find when I take it in and out of the refrigerator at home, it's more likely to get oxidized and the flavor is not as good a quality, Like if you start eating it quite regularly, you'll develop a taste for, like, oh, I let this sit out and I don't like this taste as much. But if it tastes okay to you, I mean, it's fine. Like I said, the pH keeps it totally safe. But like if you start with a larger jar, you can always, move down. Like you have a quart, half of it, and you put it in a pint jar. And then half of it, you put it in a 4-ounce jar, and hopefully you eat that really pretty quick.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we have a question in the chat asking what you suggest for the 30% with cabbage for kraut.
What I suggest, for other things, 30%. Why I suggest, for kraut, I mean, I was just saying, like this, for example, is 30% cabbage, and then, or no, it's 70% cabbage, and then the other ingredients are like composing the remainder 30%, like the carrots and the onions. There's carrots and onions and red peppers and cilantro. So it's just a general idea. I mean, of course, you can do plain 100% all cabbage, and you can do, you know, plain vegetables, but then you'll wind up. This, by the way, is burdock root. But if you don't, I guess the 30% ratio for the cabbage is really based on this method of using the juice from the cabbage. Like you have enough cabbage juice to completely submerge the vegetables. It's not a hard rule, it's just a general idea. So this could be 50% carrots and 50% cabbage. And then I probably would have just added a little bit of brine to be sure I had enough juice to cover it.
You said you made a mixture with lime. Does the acid counteract the fermentation process?
Well, it might be that it's such a small amount that it doesn't. I know theoretically it should, but I actually find that my Curdito is probably one of the more stable recipes, and I wonder if it might be protecting it a little bit. Like it doesn't tend to mold as quickly as carrots by themselves. Like if I make ginger carrots, the ginger carrots really tend to want to yeast more. The Curdito with the lime juice never really seems yeasty to me. So I thought maybe the lime protects it a little bit, but I only use a little bit, you know, it's just the tiniest bit. And I'd probably like to add a little more lime when I actually go to eat it too, because I just really like lime. Napa cabbage is really good for kimchi. Napa cabbage is excellent. And hot sauce is really, really like probably the most satisfying thing to do with fermenting. I'll just chop up some chili peppers and a little bit of garlic. And usually there is enough juice in that, like after it sits for a day, that it gets more juicy. The first day there's not a lot of juice, but the second day there's more juice. And I will let these sit and then push them down again because of that. But you can let hot sauce ferment like up to a year, and I don't think it ever goes bad. Like literally, I don't, like it might last, I can't say forever, but for some reason hot sauce lasts longer than anything else. And the flavor profile of fermented hot sauce is supposedly it's like just way better than any other hot sauce. People just love it so much. And you can play with different kinds of peppers. I wanted to tell you guys, you know, with COVID, this last year was kind of like victory gardens all over again. Like everybody's wanting to learn how to garden again and everything. And it's really cool to save seeds. I knew a guy who was working with the university developing seeds, and I had never heard of this before, but this is a heatless habanero. So habaneros have like the most intense flavor of all the peppers, right? I don't like hot things, so I'm pretty excited about a heatless habanero. Pretty cool. Any other questions? I was expecting a lot of questions. It's so funny I don't see anybody. I'm all alone.
I'm curious where you sell your products.
Food co-ops, pretty much, like in
Okay.
just this area, mainly food co-ops. I found that grocery stores, people weren't quite as well informed at grocery stores.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's changing over the years, though.
Okay.
Yeah, so I wonder if, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the spices you use too. If you're like interested, I mean, this is kind of hard because I'm used to really interacting a lot with people and getting conversations going. To find out, like, I'm curious what you guys want to ferment. But if you're getting into it for health benefits and stuff, I really suggest using turmeric, like a brine. Like these are just little, I mean, they're pickles, right? They're just little chunks of turnip, or you could use carrots and, you know, rutabaga or radishes. But turmeric is a really nice one to add to a brine vegetable. And I guess we should talk about how to incorporate this in a meal, right? Like you think of a pickle, you just eat it, right, by itself, but it's also an ingredient, right? You can slice it thin and put it in your nori rolls or your tortilla wraps or on your pizza or on your sandwich, you know, in your rice dishes. Egg dishes are the best with the fermented foods.
Do you ever do pickled onions?
Yeah, so I heard somewhere that in Africa, there's a really common like street snack food that they ferment onions and then they dry them out in little balls. And I did an experiment on that and I thought it was really great, but well, these are ramps, right? This was my friends at Harmony Valley Farm, they sustainably manage their ramps in a way that they're increasing the population every year, and they offer them for sale at grocery stores and stuff. And they asked me to make this for their CSA. So I don't encourage people to go harvest ramps in the wild. It'd be neat if you found ramps, if you could you know, increase the population, but it takes a ramp like 7 years to grow in the wild, and it's kind of a trendy thing for people to go out and harvest them. And I don't harvest them at all. I try to increase the population. But yeah, it's a great thing. Like these could be green onions, just the same, right? If you had green onions in here, that's a really nice garnish, or, you know, like charcuterie kind of addition. Yeah, onions. Things that are green do tend to want to get slimy if you ferment, like kale. You might do that a little quicker. Like vegetable or like fruits are really fast. There's so much sugar in them. You don't ferment fruits for a month at all. You do that for a couple of days probably, and it's just a really quick ferment, like even 1 day. If you wanted to experiment with fermenting fruits, it's kind of fun and interesting, but also super susceptible to yeast. But yeah, so greens are a little touchy. When I want to add seaweed to a ferment, I'll put that in when I'm repacking it and putting it in the cooler. Like I don't ferment the seaweed because that would probably explode. There's so much salt and life in seaweed. Yeah, put your seaweed in after it's fermented when you put it in the fridge. But it's a great thing to add.
We do have a question in the chat asking what size jar would be the best for the purple cabbage you had?
Well, I mean, this isn't even a whole pound. Right? So like a bigger cabbage might be up to 2 pounds. So a quart jar is 2 pounds, a pint jar is 1 pound. So it's easiest, you know, to save yourself some grief, it'd be easiest to weigh your vegetables before you start packing. I run into this when I do hands-on classes, like if you don't know, like you're making this kraut and then you're short, right? You want a gallon jar and you know, you have like that much space left. So just weigh your vegetable before you start packing, before you start. And then you know, this wouldn't even be a whole pound, I don't think. So you want something a little bigger than that to make a pint jar. But if you're gonna go through the trouble, you might as well start with a gallon, right? Because it'll last for years, right? Oh, I guess I just breezed over this tomatillo thing. This is just like hot sauce, right? Tomatillo is a fruit. Well, oh, I'm contradicting myself here. These are fruits, they can ferment forever. I guess it's because there's no sugar in them, probably, right? There's no sugar, I don't know why these are a special fruit, but tomatillo, I only did these for about 5 days, and it's amazing. Tomatillo salsa verde, it was so good, sweet, and just really good. So I fermented them about 5 days, just like this. I chopped them up, put them in the jar, there was plenty of juice, and then I put it through the blender and just blended it and added a little lime. Yeah, what else can I tell you? I guess you don't know if I missed anything. Yeah, so we say keep refrigerated to ensure the longest shelf life. Not that you have to, it's just. Oh, I guess the last thing I always think of at the end too is cucumber pickles, right? They're a little different too. Cucumber pickles, you need to add a tannin source. That would be oak leaves, grape leaves, horseradish leaves. Any of those kind of leaves have a high content of tannin, which stops the cucumber from getting too soft. So you want a whole bunch of those crammed in your jar, like maybe six leaves in a quart even. And you have to cut off the blossom end, and then you want a higher salt content. So with cucumbers, you're probably doing about 3% or a little bit more, but I would suggest finding a recipe online for that, because I've kind of had a hard time with pickles. I've done some good ones, but it's a little bit tricky with the pickles. They really want to get soft. But I guess it's really common that Jewish people in New York area, like sour pickles is the thing. And here we don't really have sour pickles.
Would dill fall into that category? You said tannin.
No, but you certainly can add dill or pickling spice, whatever you want to, yeah. No, the tannin, it has to be oak leaves or grape leaves or horseradish leaves. I've never tried using, like in brewing, you can buy like tannic acid that they add to brewing things. I've never tried that with ferments. But, when the pickles are coming on, when the cucumbers are coming on, there's wild grapes are everywhere. It's really easy to find a wild grapevine. If you go to any natural area, they're just everywhere. And oak trees are pretty darn common too. So yeah, both of those are really good things.
We have a question in the chat asking if you have any recommendations for cookbooks or specific authors that you like to find recipes.
Yeah, definitely. So I was mentioned in Fermentation on Wheels. Tara, who wrote that book, she had a dream that she was traveling the country in a school bus teaching fermentation. So she did it. This young woman got in the school bus and drove across the whole country, meeting every fermenter from coast to coast. And she stopped at my place for a little while. That's a really sweet book with some beautiful recipes. Fermentation on Wheels. The Bible of fermentation is definitely Sandor Katz, The Art of Fermentation. That's the thick book that's got more than anything else in it. But his first book that he wrote, Wild Fermentation, is much smaller, and that's really excellent too. And I spent some time with Sandor, and he's really a great guy. And he actually has a website, wildfermentation.com, that has forums where people talk about stuff, and I think his Facebook page is pretty active. Cultures for Health is a nice website for recipe ideas. She's a pretty active blogger, and I think she's got ebooks and books available. Oh, I never pronounced this one person's name, so I'm not even gonna, I'd be happy to share if anybody wants more links. I used to have a link page on my website and I took it down when I changed websites, but I do have a list of recommended books too that I'd be happy to share if anybody emails me. But definitely Sandor Katz is like, he's the top fermenter in the world. He's definitely gotta have that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those recommendations. I put links in the chat if anyone is interested, or you can just search in our catalog on fermented foods. And if you haven't heard the good news yet, the library is now open for grab and go or intentional browsing. So feel free to take a look on the catalog and come up with some recipe books, and then feel free to stop in the library and check those out and get started on your fermentation at home.
No doubt. Oh, go for some Asian ones if you see books on Asian fermenting, or like there was one that was all Japanese ferments. That looked really good. Yeah, I bet you have a good selection there. Yeah, how are we doing? Oh, yeah, just a couple more minutes for any last thoughts. Oh, the pH test strip, you could probably track it down on Amazon is all I can say about that if you really want a pH test strip, you know. But you can also trust your nose and your taste buds too.
I have a question for you. I have a 2-year-old, and do you have any recommendations for what toddlers like in terms of like fermented vegetables?
If you need it at home, I would guess that like carrot sticks would be pretty great.
Oh, sure. Yeah, she loves carrots. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I made a kid kraut one time that I put, so apples are a little weird, but I put red pepper and apple and beets. You know, I was trying to find like what would be a little bit more sweet, but you know, little people, it's funny, I feel like they develop their taste based on their parents, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you say, oh, I love this, then they probably love it too.
Sure. Yeah, we'll just try some stuff.
Yeah, well, this has been pretty fun. I appreciate not really meeting you guys, but appreciate that you took the time to listen. And like I said, you're welcome to email me, physiology@gmail.com, any questions that come up or whatever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last thing, I did forget to say that why I brought the burdock root out is because I sent this to a lab to be tested, and burdock root is a wonderful thing to increase the community of probiotics that grow in your food. It's just an excellent thing, and something you could Google. You could look into the benefits of burdock root. It'd be kind of fun.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thanks again so much, Faith. We really appreciate all that excellent knowledge, and I know I'm excited to get started fermenting at home. So thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, feel free to check out fermentation through our library catalog to pick up your recipe books and get started. And feel free to check out Faith's website if you want to try some of her ferments at home. And thanks for joining us. Have a great night. Take good care. Bye-bye.